This presentation is about the virgin birth of Jesus. Of course, there are other myths of virgin births. Those also will be discussed in due course. But before we go into it, we have to go into some fundamental aspects of life itself. In Greek mythology, there is the story of Sisyphus. He was a cruel king who was condemned to roll a boulder up to the top of a hill only to have it roll back to the bottom. He is fated to push it up once again to have it roll back in a futile and endless cycle till the end of time. Nobel laureate Albert Camus, in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, saw Sisyphus as depicting the absurdity of human life. But Camus concludes one must imagine Sisyphus as happy because the struggle itself towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. In like manner, at the basic level, all life forms process solar energy in the form of different foods. We find food, consume it, and use the energy therefrom to find more food and energy. From this perspective, life is as meaningless as the fate of Sisyphus. However, we delude ourselves by lending a meaningless meaning to life by pretending that the Sisyphean cycle of life is somehow meaningful so that we can get on with our futile lives. In the process, we spin all kinds of stories and myths to make our existence bearable and meaningful. As you know, computers and mobile phones, as well as robots and artificial intelligence, have hardware and energy processing mechanisms, as well as operating systems and many kinds of apps to handle different eventualities which they are designed for. In like manner, all flora and fauna have bodies which generate the energy they need, as well as an inbuilt or inborn range of programs or talents which we call their essential nature. In addition, we require other skills learned from the environment we live in, which we call nurture. The ultimate aim of all these hardware and software, or nature and nurture, is to heave the stone up the hill to have it roll back again to its original position and to solve all kinds of problems which crop up in the process. We then push it up again in this vicious, ridiculous and endless cycle until death steps in against our inclinations to put an end to our agony on earth. The most significant of our inbuilt operating systems is our fear of death. No living system, including plants, can survive even momentarily unless it flees from death and destruction or prevents them in their own characteristic ways, such as plants producing poisonous chemicals to keep their attackers at bay. Combined with the fear of death, and almost as important as fear of death, is the driving force we call hunger. Fear of death cannot force us to take any action unless we have the energy to do so. Consequently, fear of death and our hunger for food and energy are the most important forces that drive our lives at the individual level as well as at the social level. Evolution of life itself is a process which helps us to handle these driving forces which dictate our lives in the ever-changing situations of our environment. A third driving force which has evolved in this process and drives us both at the individual as well as at the social level is our sexual urge. Our quest for security and food, as well as for the satiation of sexual urge, form three of the most important pillars or driving forces which shape our lives, societies, and culture. The sexual urge is an inbuilt operating system which helps us to survive at a social level. And obviously, there were sexual urges before we began to live in societies and to formulate social codes, rules, and religions to regulate our societies. Consequently, the way we understand our sexual reproduction mechanism influences our social codes and mores, as well as our religions and myths. Like the feasibility of our quest for security and food, sexual relationships and the way we understand them also form one of the most fundamental aspects of societies, cultures, politics, religions, and all other social disciplines and institutions. At the time we evolved into Homo sapiens, the basic and most primitive stage of identity, we lived in societies like other social animals. In these societies, the most fundamental relationship between members of the society was that of the mother, a position which we need no further evidence than social acceptance. Consequently, other relationships between members were marked through this relationship with their mothers. As a result, these prehistoric or Stone Age societies were matriarchal in nature and with women holding considerable clout in these primitive societies. In these societies, everyone knew who his father or rather his mother and maternal siblings and kin were. In contrast, there were no regulations for sexual intercourse. There was no position called the father. These Stone Age societies had unrestrained promiscuous relationships, and it was not uncommon for fathers to have sexual intercourse with their daughters and for brothers to have it with their sisters. This system of brothers having sex with sisters survived into recent times, as a result of which we find Abraham marrying his half sister Sarah, and then there is Cleopatra marrying her brother Ptolemy 13, and there is Isis marrying Osiris, and then Cronus marrying Rhea, and so on. The men in these societies considered all others as their uncles, siblings, or their children. As rational beings, we have to find relationship between causes and their consequences. According to psychologists, if we do not find a logical answer to the relationship between cause and consequences, it may lead to some mental stress. In the modern world, we resort to research to find the exact relationships between causes and consequences and the exact conditions under which such causal relationships come about. Our ancestors had no such luxuries. Instead, they resorted to their fertile intuitions to find the relationship between causes and consequences. In the process, our ancestors invented fictional agents such as gods, as well as intuitive dogmas of imagination to explain the causal relationship between events. Such speculation helped our ancestors get on with their lives, such as finding a meaning in life. Our ancestors considered these fictional agents as the causes of rains, diseases, drought, storms, and other natural events which impacted their lives. This in turn led them to adopt procedures or ceremonies to placate or to mollify these fictional agents who caused most of the good and bad things on earth. Life consists of millions of events begging for answers as regards their causal relationships. One of the most significant of these questions begging for answers was the causal relationship between sex and reproduction. Our ancestors had no means of finding a scientific answer to their concerns regarding sex and reproduction. Consequently, they adopted many intuitive answers to their concerns regarding sex and reproduction. One of their many intuitive speculations in this regard was that most women had a whole germ or embryo or seed of life in their belly right from their birth. This embryo sprang to life at puberty, and when a fertile woman had an intercourse with a man, his semen served as food for the fetus. Consequently, they assumed that all the men who had intercourse with the mother contributed to the growth of the embryo and the child. As a result, all males who had intercourse with the mother were considered as fathers of the child. The child born of this intercourse was considered the child of all men who had intercourse with the mother. These primitive matriarchal societies then evolved into more complex and settled societies with the adoption of agriculture as the mainstay for their food and energy needs. Consequently, their social mores and ideas evolved to make the agricultural way of life more efficient. One of the most momentous ideas which evolved and influenced human history was the origin of the meme of private property in agricultural societies. With the institution of private property, the egalitarian blood relationships of the Stone Age gave way to the hierarchical relationships based on private property and its trappings. One of the most important offshoots of the system of private property was the institution of marriage. With agricultural and especially pastoral way of life, the matriarchal societies of the Stone Age gave way to the patriarchal societies of the Agrarian Age, where land, the main factor of production, as well as other assets, fell into the possession of the males. Consequently, primitive matriarchal societies of the past gave way to the patriarchal societies of the agricultural and pastoral age. A sad outcome of this development was the demotion of the powerful and dominating matriarchs of the past to the position of mere chattel or wares. And just another item of commerce in the band's balance sheet. In fact, the men traded in women, slaves, concubines, and what have you. The propertied men of the agricultural age wanted to transfer their wealth to their own bloodline on their death. To ensure this bloodline, the practice of women being tied down solely to the properties and to the male who owned them had to be found. It was thus marriage was instituted in agricultural societies. Along with the institution of marriage, virginity and chastity were strictly enforced on the woman, whereas the men were free to sow their seeds as far and wide as male nature dictates. It was in this context of private properties, transfer of ownership along the bloodline, and other factors associated with the transfer of private properties that institutions of marriage, families, as well as its social values such as virginity, chastity, and other virtues came to the forefront in agrarian societies. The bonus or the premium placed by agricultural societies on chastity and virginity lasts even to this day even in modern societies, though we have moved from agricultural way of life to an industrial one, in which marriage and families have not as much relevance as in the agricultural age. It was also in this milieu of agricultural and economic development that nomadic Stone Age communities coalesced into villages, cities, states, empires, and so forth. Thus, we see that social institutions such as family, private property, and the state evolved in tandem with economic compulsions of the agricultural way of life. Not only political institutions, but religious memes and its fundamental elements such as gods, angels, and devils, and so on, also evolved in tandem with the economic realities of the agricultural economy. Religious concepts and memes arose some 40,000 or more years ago in the Stone Age. These concepts and memes were transferred among contemporaries as well as from one generation to another by word of mouth. But verbal communications are not reliable and errors of communications are inevitable. This leads to loss of fidelity or degree of exactness with which something is copied or reproduced during verbal communication. This is called entropy losses in communication. The way a message is interpreted by the speaker and or the listener also contributes to the entropy losses in communication. Such entropy losses lead to mutation of ideas and concepts and even contents of verbal communications. Myths thus transmitted by word of mouth among contemporaries as well as from one generation to another kept changing and metamorphosing. Consequently, after a few verbal transmission from one man to another and from one generation to another, the messages and myths mutate to such an extent that they become totally unrecognizable from the original message or myth. This is like one species of animals evolving ever so slowly into another species with each and every reproduction. As a result, each Stone Age society and individual had their own sets of beliefs and myths as unique as their fingerprints. Perhaps it was these egalitarian societies of Stone Age which are the most freedom of beliefs in human society or human history. These ever-changing nebulous or amorphous sets of myths and beliefs lasted well into the agrarian age with some exceptions. Thus, in the Stone Age, gods were often pictured along the lines of matriarchs of those societies, such as the goddess Kali in Indian myths. With the evolution of Stone Age societies into agricultural societies, gods and supernatural entities took on agrarian forms of power, such as chieftains, kings, and emperors, with court officials such as the messengers of gods, as well as courtesans like the Apsaras in Indian myths and the Houris in Arabian myths. This process of morphing human characters into animals as well as mythical figures is called anthropomorphism. All myths and fables as well as cartoons such as Donald Duck and Tom and Jerry are forms of anthropomorphism. We have seen that in the matriarchal societies of Stone Age, many believed that women were born with the human fetuses or embryos in their bellies and that the male semen nourished it. But with the switchover to patriarchal agricultural societies, their causal analysis of events also mutated. The new thinking as regards sex and reproduction was that males held the embryos or seeds in their genitals, and that in the process of sexual intercourse, the man planted his seed or embryo into the woman's womb, where it grew into a child or on maturity. In short, according to the new way of thinking, man had the whole seed in his loins, whereas the woman was merely the field where his seed was planted. The blame for childless marriages were often placed on the woman, who were depicted as barren vis-a-vis agricultural fields. This was the socio-economic environment in which the concept or meme of virgin birth sprouted forth in these societies, which upheld agrarian virtues of virginity and chastity. These virgin births were limited to mythical gods and terrestrial women. This in turn meant that the mythical figures born of virgin birth were wholly divine in seed or essence, with only nominal inputs or contributions by humans from the women. There are many descriptions of virgin birth in myths which had their origin in the agrarian age. Genesis 6:12 says, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took these women as their wives. Any they chose." This means that in those days when this book of the Genesis was written, the Jews believed in gods. They were believed in many gods. Then in the Indian myths, there are many instances of this virgin birth. Thus, there is Krishna, the myth of Krishna. According to this, the Vishnu, the deity, is the agent of conception as well as the child or the offspring of this virgin birth. Because of his sympathy for the earth, the divine Vishnu himself descended into the womb of a woman called Devaki, who gave birth to Krishna. In another of the Hindu myths, Bharadwaj, as rishi or a sage, went on with his companions to the Ganges to perform his ablutions. There he was bewitched by the beauty of an apsara or a nymph who had come there to bathe. The sage was overcome by desire, which caused him to ejaculate involuntarily. The sage captured or collected this semen in a vessel, and in time this vessel gave birth to a warrior called Drona, which means the son of a vessel or a son of a pot. In another incident in the Indian myths, Vasu, a Chedi king, was on a hunting expedition when he had a nocturnal emission while dreaming of his wife. Using an eagle, this king sent his semen to his queen by an eagle, but due to a fight in midair with another eagle, the semen fell into a river and was swallowed by a fish. In time, this fish gave birth to a girl called Satyavati, who finally grew up to the matriarch of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who are the main characters of the Hindu Maha-epic called Mahabharata. Similarly, in Hittite mythology, the god Anu was overthrown by his son Kumarbi. Anu attempted to flee, but Kumarbi bit off his father's genitals and swallowed them, and banished him to the underworld. As a consequence of swallowing Anu's genitals, Kumarbi became impregnated with Anu's son Teshub and 4 other offspring. Teshub overthrew his father Kumarbi, thus avenging his father Anu's overthrow and mutilation. This account later became the basis of the Greek myth of Uranus's castration by his son Cronus. Cronus then flung away his father's castrated organs into the ocean foams, where it gave birth to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and fertility. Most of the kings of Egypt claimed linear descent from the gods through virgin birth. Even Alexander the Great was finally celebrated as a child of divine birth, which meant that again there were no women involved except the virgins who were there. Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome, were born by Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin. Rhea Silvia conceived them when the god Mars visited her in a sacred grove dedicated to Mars. Then there was Horus, who was born to the goddess Isis after she retrieved all the dismembered body parts of her husband Osiris, except his penis, which was thrown into the Nile and eaten by a catfish. Isis used her magic powers to resurrect Osiris and fashion a phallus to conceive her son, Isis, Horus. If you search Wikipedia for virgin births, you can find instances of many such mythical virgin births from Norway to China and Japan. The virgin birth meme was picked up by the gospel writers to embellish their accounts. The virgin birth meme implies that the child is wholly divine without any human input or adulteration. This dogma was formed at a time when people believed that only a male contributed to the birth of a child through his seed. Now we know that things are not so. We know that the female ovum also contributes as much to the male sperm to the making of a child. Consequently, all these virgin births in the myths are born of the mistaken theory that was in vogue in the agrarian societies in which these religions sprouted and developed. It is now well known that many incidents narrated in the Bible, such as making the first man from clay and blowing life into it, the story of the flood, the story of the Commandments on tablets of clay, and many others are plagiarized from other Middle Eastern myths, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, as well as from historical events such as the Emperor Hammurabi of Babylon installing tablets all over his empire with his codes or commandments chiseled on or engraved into the tablets. The stories of virgin births were even more popular in ancient myths, as we have already seen. It is obvious from the above accounts that it was not divine inspiration that led to the launching of the Bible and the Gospels and the stories therein, such as Jesus' virgin birth. Instead, it was thousands of years of evolutions and mutations of many means, such as private property, women being merely nourishing fields for human seed, as in agriculture, as well as a premium based on their virginity and chastity. The New Testament contains 27 books. Of these, the story of Jesus is narrated in the Gospels, which were written towards the close of the first century and the beginning of the second. But about 50 years before that, before the other books of the New Testament were written, came the epistles of Paul, which laid the foundation and the guidelines for the other books of the New Testament. Actually, it was Paul that founded Christianity, according to modern evaluations. None of Paul's epistles or the first works of the New Testament narrate the virgin birth of Jesus. Instead, Paul, who laid the foundation for Christianity, paints Jesus as a human being sans the divine nature. The meme of the virgin birth of Jesus came into currency with the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. They were the ones who spun these stories of the virgin birth of Jesus. According to Wikipedia, Matthew and Luke agree that Mary's husband was named Joseph and that he was of the Davidic heritage and that he played no role in Jesus' divine conception. Beyond this, the two Gospels give different narratives of the nativity of Jesus. Matthew underlines the virginity of Mary by reference to the book of Isaiah and by his narrative that Joseph had no sexual relationship with Mary until after the birth of Jesus. However, this does not leave open the possibility that they had sex after the birth of Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, 18 to 25 states, "Now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to make Mary your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us." When Joseph woke from sleep, he did as the angel Lord commanded him, and he took her as his wife. But he had no marital relationship with her until she had born a son, and he named him Jesus. The aforesaid prophet in Matthew 1:22-23 is Isaiah, According to Isaiah 7:14, around 735 BC, the King Ahab of Judea, received a message from the prophet Isaiah saying, "Therefore the Lord of his own shall give you a sign. Behold, the young woman is with child, and she shall bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel." This is generally taken by Judaic commentators to be a reference to the non-miraculous birth of Ezekiah, the son of Ahaz, and the 13th king of Judah, who was considered a very righteous king in the book of Kings. However, Matthew 1:23 borrowed this prophecy as divine inspiration and wrote, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and she shall bring forth a son. They shall call his name Emmanuel." Just a slip of the pen and the mutation of the word young woman in Isaiah to the word virgin in Matthew gave rise to the meme or idea of the virgin birth of Jesus. In contrast, Luke's narrative of the nativity is as follows. Chapter 1, 26. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greetings this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with the God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy, and he will be called the Son of God." What is more, these narratives of Matthew and Luke differ in that the angel appeared to Mary in Matthew, or appeared to Joseph in Matthew, and the angel appeared to Mary in Luke. On the other hand, Mark, the earliest gospel on which both Matthew and Luke source their work, has no birth story and states that Jesus' mother had no belief in her son, as if she had forgotten the angel's visit. And John is totally silent about the virgin birth of Jesus. Thus, the nativity of Jesus is limited only to the canonical gospels of Matthew and Luke. There are other accounts in other gospels, such as that of Thomas, in which Jesus is painted as a twin. There are even more stories about Jesus and his life. Thus, the Mandaeans hold that Thomas the Apostle was the twin brother of Jesus and was crucified in Jesus' place. This is a variation of the gospel story called the substitution hypothesis, whereby it was not Jesus that was crucified, but someone else. This substitution hypothesis is described in Wikipedia, and anyone interested can go through them. This account in the Wikipedia gives an account of the substitution hypothesis, which states that the sightings of a risen Jesus are explained not by physical resurrection, but by the existence of a different person, a twin or lookalike, who could have impersonated Jesus after his death or died in the place of Jesus on the cross. It is a position held by some Gnostics in the first 3 centuries, as well as by some modern Mandaeans, Muslims, and many Japanese Christians. I do not know how that theory came to Japan. The Gospel of Barnabas describes, the Gospel of Barnabas is one of the non-canonical Gospels. This gospel describes Jesus escaping crucifixion through being raised alive to heaven by a bevy of angels. Subsequently, Judas Iscariot is supernaturally transformed to look like Jesus and is subsequently crucified in Jesus' place. The Gospel of Mark 6:3 and the Gospel of Matthew 13:55 to 56 mention James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon as brothers of Jesus, the son of Mary. The same verses also mention unnamed sisters of Jesus. Thus, Mark 3:31 to 32 tells about Jesus' mother and brothers looking for Jesus. Later on, as Christianity became widespread, Mary became the central figure of Christianity next only to Jesus. In time, the meme of virgin birth of Jesus evolved into the Immaculate Conception of Mary, as well as into the Assumption into heaven, both of which were declared as infallible ex cathedra dogmas by different popes. So much for the virgin birth of Jesus. We shall now examine the nativity of Jesus described in the Gospels. Let us start with the narration of the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospels. Here again, it is Matthew and Luke who describe this genealogy or list this genealogy of Jesus. Matthew chapter 1, 1 to 17 lists the patrilineage of Jesus from David through his son Solomon to Joseph, Mary's husband. It lists 27 generations, including David and Joseph. In contrast, Luke chapter 3, 23 to 38 lists 42 generations from David through his son Nathan to Mary's husband Joseph. If these narratives are taken at face value, it is Joseph who is descended from David and not Jesus, as he was the product of a virgin birth. In those days, except for a few who could read and write, most were totally illiterate. Few, if any, kept any chronicles on a day-to-day basis. Rome was one of the few exceptions to this. They had an entire empire to rule, and they had to keep an account of the events going on in the different parts of the empire. So we have only chronicles left by the Romans to give a timeline, a reliable timeline on the events of the Gospels. According to Matthew chapter 2, 16 to 18, Jesus' birth took place during the reign of Herod the Great, king of Judea, who ordered the execution of all male children under the age of 2 in the vicinity of Bethlehem. There is historical evidence that Herod ruled Judea under Roman supervision until his death in 4 BCE or 4 years before the birth of Jesus. So, by Matthew's account, Jesus must have been born some years before 4 BCE. There is also no mention whatsoever of Herod massacring the innocent children in the Roman chronicles. On the other hand, there is a narration of a child massacre in the Indian myths when Krishna was born. This massacre was ordered by Kamsa, who was Krishna's maternal uncle and the king. He saw the birth of Krishna as a threat to his future, and so he ordered the massacre of the innocents. Since this narrative of Krishna and the massacre of innocents preceded the Gospels by a few hundred years, one can easily guess the source of the story of the massacre of infants or innocents in Matthew's version of the Gospels. In contrast, Luke chapter 2, 1 to 7 narrates the account of Jesus' birth as follows. When the time for the birth drew near, Caesar Augustus commanded a census of the Roman domains, and Joseph took Mary to Bethlehem, the ancient city of David, as he was of the house of David. Joseph was the house of David. So it came to pass that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, And since there was nowhere for them to stay in the town, the infant was laid in a manger while the angels announced his birth to a group of shepherds who worshipped him as the Messiah and the Lord. There was indeed such a census or enumeration in Judea, and it was taken by Publius Sulpicius Quirinius, Roman governor of Syria. This census is recorded to have been set in motion in Judea about 6 years after Jesus' birth, 6 CE. It caused a limited and unsuccessful uprising by the Judas of Galilee. And the Acts of the Apostles 5, chapter 5, verse 37 refers to the failed Jewish uprising against the census, because the Jews thought that such an enumeration was against their religion. I don't know how it turned out to be against their religion. So the event of Jesus' birth described by Luke above must have taken place a few years after 6 CE, when the census was declared. So according to Matthew, Jesus is born long before Herod died in 4 BCE, and according to Luke, Jesus is born long after the census was set in motion by 6 CE. Consequently, there is an inexplicable discrepancy of over 10 years between Matthew's and Luke's accounts of the nativity, which would not have come about if the two accounts of the gospel narratives of the nativity of Jesus were divinely inspired. The narration in Luke that Joseph took Mary for the census to Bethlehem, the ancient city of David, as he was of the house of David, is even more absurd for a God-inspired book. Thus, Joseph and Mary traveled a considerable distance from Nazareth, where they lived, to Bethlehem, which was the city of David, who was Joseph's direct ancestor, according to Luke. According to Matthew, Joseph comes 27 generations after David, whereas according to Luke, Joseph comes 42 generations from David. A generation means the period or the time lag between the birth of an individual and the birth of his or her firstborn. This is about 20 to 25 years for women and 25 to 30 for men. So there was an interval of 700 to 1200 years between David and Joseph. So according to Luke, Joseph took his pregnant wife from Nazareth to Bethlehem because his ancestors had lived there about 1,000 years ago. This defeats the very purpose of a census, which is to give a clearer idea of the people in the place they live in the present. If Luke's account were sane, then for a census in any of the countries on the American continent, all the people of that country would have to go to Europe or Africa or Asia, because the people there are of European, African and Asian origin some 500 years ago. This is totally absurd. There are many such discrepancies and incongruities in the Gospels, and so we can call the Gospels a comedy of errors rather than a God-inspired work. In fact, the whole meme of a God-inspired book is illogical and ridiculous. Such cock and bull stories gave rise to all the religions, including Christianity, which was a comparatively small cult in the Roman Empire. There were other bigger cults such as Manichaeism, based on similar cock and bull stories, and which had far more acceptance than Christianity. Then in the 4th century, Constantine, the Roman emperor, began to advance the cause of Christianity and its cock and bull stories in preference to other cock and bull stories of other cults. So it was under Constantine's patronage that Christianity and its myths were widely accepted in the Roman Empire. If Constantine had favored Manichaeism or any of the other cults of Rome, it would have been that cult he favored, which would have been the religion of Rome and of Rome. Constantine was followed by Emperor Theodosius, who raised Christianity to even greater heights through his imperial patronage and power. Centuries later, there came Emperor Charlemagne, who promoted Christianity with the sword, as a result of which about 3,600 Saxons who refused to convert to Christianity were massacred. Later on, the Europeans colonized the world. Consequently, their religion, Christianity, became the most widespread religion in the world. Had it not been for Constantine, Theodosius, Charlemagne, and colonization, Christianity would have suffered a premature death or gone into obscurity, as many similar cults did, as the pre-Christian religions of Rome and Greece did. We now have the technology to pass on any message all over the world to billions in a few seconds or minutes through internet or so many other modern means of communication. God must have had even more advanced technologies in his arsenal from the beginning of time. If so, why did he need the help of books, prophets, messengers, and incarnations, as well as aid from interpreters and apologists to spread his message over hundreds of years with the help of powerful emperors? Why did he not use the most modern technologies of the future to spread his message instead of picking up a few self-proclaimed messengers from an obscure corner of the earth to spread his ridiculous stories of virgin births and talking snakes, and as well as talking donkeys? God has programmed all animals and their genes to do what they are designed to do. So no one has to teach a monkey to climb trees or to cling to its mother as soon as it's born. In like manner, we also have been programmed to genetically to the human way of life. If the omnipotent has thus programmed us to our ways of life 200,000 years ago, we could have as easily been programmed to the true religion and the true God, instead of making us fight over which is the true God and the true religion. Thank you for listening to me. I am from India, and for me, English is an acquired language. So I am not as smooth as most of the English speakers are, or Americans are. This may please be overlooked. Thank you once again.